Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Professor James Arvanitakis. He is a professor at Western Sydney University. He's a lecturer in the humanities and a member of the university's Institute for Cultural and Society. Welcome, James.
Well, thank you, Amy. How are you?
Good. And I'm so looking forward to just learning about your journey because I was reading about your bio and that you were a former economist, a free market advocate, and you changed your position after witnessing child and indentured labor. And when did that all take place?
That all happened now, we're going back about almost 20 years. So I was working in the finance industry. I had a good 10 years in the finance industry. Really quite a successful career, but I was, the child of immigrant parents here in Australia, and the big focus, was having a safe and stable and sort of wealthy lifestyle. When you're sort of working class and you sort of grew up in a working class family. Mum and Dad wanted me to have a job where I got to wear a suit, and working in banking was that opportunity, and they felt that we had secured the future by me getting such a job.
When you were working as an economist and working in the business wearing a suit and tie, as you were saying, how did you witness child and indentured labor? What was it that took you down that road?
Yeah, look, I'd worked for 10 years and I decided to take a year off. I was in quite a privileged position that I sort of went, okay, I'm going to take a year off and travel, because I'd spent so much time working that I kind of realised that, the sort of most of my 20s had passed by, and I was like, okay, I'm going to take a year off and travel. And I ended up travelling around the world. I got a round the world ticket, and as I was travelling through parts of Latin America, I ended up in some remote places and actually did a tour of a copper mine, an old copper mine. And while I was in that copper mine, I witnessed children 8, 9, 10 years old working in these mines. And at the time, it reminded me of my niece and nephews being about that age, and it really shocked me into seeing that the ultimate capital, free markets without any controls always look for the cheaper source of labour. And in poor countries, unfortunately, that cheaper source of labour is children.
And so how did that change your life? Because it sounds like it was a life-changing experience.
Yeah, it changed my life dramatically, because what I realised, what I found out was that the metals that were being collected from this mine were making their way into all sorts of different products, including cars. And I kind of drew a connection between my choice as a consumer and the impacts that was having around the world. And so I truly believed that economic globalization was going to help lift people out of poverty, and I think elements do. But what I also realized that it made people very vulnerable. And what I followed that up with was, after I got back, I started looking into the way that some communities in Australia were being left behind, and the consequences of that. And in Australia's got its own experience of Rust Belt communities, and so this kind of made me realise that we as humans, we need to be part of the economy, but the economy also needs to meet our human needs as well, and not just wealth production. And we need to think about those who are left behind, those who are vulnerable, and those who aren't as privileged as what we are. And so I became really focused in understanding, well, what economic policies could we develop that could take humanity into account?
And so when you went, did you go back to school after that to get your a different degree and become a lecturer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. I actually ended up working for some human rights and environmental rights and justice organisations. And while I was doing that, I decided to go back and do a master's in environmental policy that was really focused on the sort of the economics of the environment. And following, I went off and did a PhD in philosophy. And what I became really interested in was, it was at that point that I became really interested in understanding social relationships and how we as humans build these relationships, what makes societies function, what makes societies sort of begin to fall apart, and not just societies but also communities. And so I became really interested. That's how I became obsessed with the humanities, because I was really into the economics of life, and then I became obsessed with the humanities because I started trying to understand the connections that people make and how people carry on their lives and what follows from there.
And how do you translate that into your work as a lecturer in the humanities? How do you work with students? How do you open their eyes to other issues that are happening in society and how people are making those connections? What's your teaching style?
Yeah, what I always approach my classes from the perspective that my students, they're not empty vessels. They have this really good knowledge. They have life experiences, and some of them will have life experiences that I will not have. I've been lucky enough to be doing some teaching at the University of Wyoming, and I got to spend time there with students who have had lived in rural communities their whole lives. And here in Australia, I've worked with communities with refugee backgrounds, and so I always begin by thinking that the students in the room have as much to teach me as I have to teach them. That's the first part. And so the point of being in a classroom is to have conversations in an area where people can actually relate to the theoretical perspectives that I'm imparting on them, but relate to them in their own lives. So for me, when you start talking about humanities, and you start talking about the different theorists and the different ideas around the humanities, everything from the different sort of traditions of thinking, such as liberalism, to engaging with the arts, what you want to do is you want to present to people like a piece of clay. You help them see the clay for what it is, and then you get them to shape it depending on their own experiences. And that way you create, I suppose, an area which is what I describe as not only a safe space to discuss controversial ideas, but also a brave space where people can challenge those ideas, apply them to their own lives, and share different perspectives. And for me, that is a role of education, to kind of to have people feel empowered by the education journey, not just see it as something that I need to memorize things and just get through the exam.
Tell me about when you were recognized. It says that you were recognized internationally for your innovative teaching style. And is that what you're talking about? Is that you allow your students to really express and be open about who they are and where they come from, and you don't have a doctrine that you're teaching them? You're really allowing them to figure their own way out and find their own answers.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah. So in Australia, I've taught classes with up to 1,000 students. So you can imagine that there these big lecture rooms full of these students, and then what happens in the style that we teach in Australia is that you have these big classes where you lecture, and then you have these breakout classes of say 20 to 30 students, which assistant professors help me help run those classes. But even in those large classes, what I've always been able to do is create an environment students are open to discussing complex issues with their peers. And what I really want is for people to be challenged in a way. So I think education must make us feel a bit uncomfortable because we need to be exposed to new ideas. But at the same time, you want people to take those ideas and apply them to their own lives, their own experiences. And that's the best way, I think, for people to think about the world's different perspectives. Because if I can apply a piece of knowledge to my life, and then I can then share it with you in a way, and you can share it with me. Well, what I identify is that we have different perspectives, because no two people have exactly the same perspective. And if they can do that, then they can also find ways to communicate with each other. And for me, that is incredibly important. I think it's a way of empowering people, because my philosophy is that when we're having these discussions in class, then what we also want is for people to be able to have these discussions when they go home and when they sit in a cafe with their peers or their friends, or a bar with their mates. And so it's a way of kind of getting people to think of knowledge and the humanities as being alive, not sitting somewhere in a textbook.
Do you find in your studies and in your research that the Australian school system is similar to the United States school system?
Yeah, there are lots of similarities and some differences. And I think that's the interesting part as a humanities lecturer, is learning how to negotiate and understand the different expectations of the students that are in your class. So in Australia, we have a really highly subsidised education system. So students, I suppose, may not always, the sense of they're not paying as much. So some students will come to that class without the same kind of economic drivers to feel that they need to get the most out of it. Whereas, a lot of students in the US, they're obviously entering debt, and so they want to get as much as they can out of this sort of this moment. And so some people have different motivations. The other thing is, in Australia, the way that the system is designed is in some of those large classes that I mentioned before, their classes, they're compulsory units, so students have to do them before progressing into the next phase of their education. So often students will come into those classes without really wanting to be there. So part of what I do is to try and sort of then get them to take the curriculum and apply it into their own interests. So I'll make the curriculum flexible enough that if I have an engineering student in my class who has no interest in the humanities, I then say to them, let's talk about the importance of the humanities and engineering. Get them to think about user-centered design, get them to think about the way that historically, say, a lot of the products that were designed in the world were designed by men without actually thinking about the role of the way that women may apply those products differently. And so it's always about getting people to take the knowledge and apply it to their own experiences, but also to what they're hoping to get out of something. And it's that flexibility, I think, that has been recognised in the way that I teach.
Do you have the same income disparities that we have in the U.S.? And do you experience the social, economic differences in your students and how that plays out, even though, as you were saying, that education is largely subsidized?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think the income disparities in Australia, I suppose, as harsh as they are in the US, but yeah, we do have these quite confronting disparities. And in my class, there's been times where, one time a few years ago, I noticed in one of these large lecture rooms that I had a couple of students in the back row and they were sleeping in the class. And it's quite a loud class, if you can imagine. I play music and I'm very interactive. And during the class, I noticed they were sleeping. So I walked over to them afterwards and I said, hey, guys, is this class not working for you? And what I discovered was that they were working night shifts and then sleeping in their car to come to class. And so, one of the things I was able to do was get them to be able to sleep, be able to organise somewhere for them to sleep on campus for 3 hours before they could actually begin, before coming to class. So at least that way they had some energy, so they weren't falling asleep during a class that was a pathway for them to get out of this kind of situation. So I think as educators as well, we are often on the front line of these disparities, and we need to think about what we can do to create an environment where we can help empower those students confronting those disparities to help them find a pathway out.
Well, James, what kind of family did you grow up in? What did your parents do?
Yeah, look, I grew up in a very working class family. My dad carried bricks for a living, and my mum ironed for a living. Migrants from Greece to Australia in the 60s, both from quite, very sort of modest backgrounds. And, it's a classic migrant story where both of them came out with just a suitcase and they set up lives. And so so mum and dad were very keen for me to have a stable kind of life, and that's why they encouraged me to sort of enter when the first chance I've got to go to university, and they really helped me get there. What was interesting was when I got to university, they didn't know what university actually was, but they knew it was a place where it would open up opportunities for me. And so I'm always incredibly thankful for my parents, and I've been lucky enough to experience things that they could have not dreamed of, in some of the travel I've done, and that's followed the ability to sort of work with my mind and work with people around the world. It's incredible. I feel incredibly privileged, and so I think that has really helped me understand the perspectives of many of my students who come to university. The thing about my university here in Australia, Western Sydney, is that between 50 or 60% of the students enrolling are first in family to come to university, so first members of their family. And that was me. I was the first member of my family to enter higher education. And so they turned up like they're stunned, they're overwhelmed. And, when I did my first year at university, I failed 5 of my first 8 subjects. And I almost left and decided that, university wasn't for me. And I was lucky enough to have some peer support, but also have some great lecturers, some professors who guided me. And so I now feel that I'm kind of trying to pay it forward in a way by helping those students who are there for the first time and are really struggling, to give them the kind of support to get through that next phase of their journey.
As you do that, and as you work with students, what do you think are the biggest barriers of, maybe people or young students dropping out of school and not finishing their education? What holds them back?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably a few things that create those barriers. I mean, I think one is the idea that they don't belong. For a lot of students when they come to university, especially if they don't come from a family where higher education is the norm, it's easy for them to have a setback and not have that kind of resilience when it comes to the education system. And so they'll have a setback and they'll just think, oh well, I don't have this in me. And so I think the first thing you need to do is create an environment where those setbacks are seen as learning journeys. And I've developed this kind of this concept called mistakability, where we learn from where students are encouraged to learn from their mistakes, their errors. If they have a university setback, I think that's one. I think sometimes it's the economic imperative to need to go out and earn money because of their financial situation. And again, that's where I think it's really important that we set up, I suppose, flexible learning environments. So if a student has to work, then they can also learn in different ways. And so at Western Sydney University, I've had students who both work full time, so they're working 40, 45-hour weeks, as well as studying full time, so carrying a full time study load. And so then I go, okay, what's the environment we can set up to make sure that they can achieve both those things. The third thing, I suppose, is just not being able to understand the university culture. Culture. When I talk about culture, I talk about the everyday practices and expectations. And university for some people is you're entering almost like a different world, like there's all these formalities or all these kinds of expectations, everything from the way you write and needing to reference and source materials to expectations about when and how things are to be submitted, and all these sort of range of things, all these complex power relationships. And so it's like any anytime you enter a different culture, you need to understand the kind of the norms and expectations. And so what we need to do is break down those so that everybody can understand them, and so that way people can feel at home as quickly as possible. And part of that is to make sure that people can build social networks and they feel supported rather than that they're on their own.
They feel supported by what? What was the last part?
They feel supported rather than being on their own.
Oh, okay. So I think, my last question is the question about the millennial generation and the disappointment in going to college and maybe coming out with huge debt or not, but not finding a job, not being able to use their degree. What are the issues that you face with your younger generations? And sometimes they don't find the value of education because it gets so discouraging.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important question that we need to ask. I mean, the first thing I suppose is that there's value in education regardless. I think having an educated citizenry, is a positive thing regardless, because, we can look at everything in the world, all the challenges that we face, from sort of COVID-19 to the sort of changing climate to changing migration patterns. And I think all these things are impacting our lives in a globalized world. And so I think having an educated citizenry is just a really positive thing. I think the challenges of the changing workforce are really difficult to confront. And I think where this is where I think the university sector, the higher education sector, universities and colleges, the sort of the private sector and the government, the different levels of government need to come up with, I suppose, strategies and help both local communities but also individuals begin to negotiate the changing nature of the workforce. And there was a really great report last year that highlighted the fact that it looked at 250 different cities across America and over 3,000 counties, and how they were being impacted by the changing work patterns. And how we can see how the changes are happening. What we're lacking is sort of a coordinated policy response to those changes. And I think there's real space here for communities to become creative in the way that they respond, because unemployment doesn't just hit an individual. I think unemployment can hit a whole community. So certain regions feel like they're being left behind, and I think we need to be able to think about that in a more creative way. Everything from telecommuting to having regions have sort of, I suppose, more creative response to sort of gaps in manufacturing. For individuals, I always tell my students that I applied for 21 jobs before I got my first interview, and that at the time seemed really difficult and disheartening. And my first job was not my ideal job, but it was the one that I got, and it helped me get the foundations to I suppose launch my career. So it is a incredibly disruptive time, and I think what people need to think about was how can we best be armed for that disruption? And I think education is still one of the best ways to be armed with to help individuals and communities respond to this challenging time. And I will say, I think education in humanities is one of the most important things, because the foundation of the humanities is for us to learn to critically think and to critically adapt to complex situations. So one of the big things that I've tried to implement in Western Sydney is that no matter what degree you're pursuing, that you need to actually be exposed to some of the critical thinking in the humanities. I think it's an incredibly powerful tool to be able to apply in any career that we pursue.
Okay, so here's my challenge to you, James. When you say you're a lecturer in the humanities, and I just walked up to you on the street and I said, "What do you do for a living?" And you said, "I'm a lecturer in the humanities." And I said, "What are the humanities?" What would you say to me?
I respond to that question. I do get that question quite a lot. I talk about how it's understanding the complexity of human relationships. So why communities work together, why they function, why they fall apart, and understanding us both as individuals and what are the drivers of us as individual humans. As well as understanding the social relationships that follow. One of the things my first degree was in economics, and one of the things that economists always argue is that we're all the same. We're all driven by the same desires. We all want to maximise our utility, maximise our effort, maximise our income. Whereas, when you study the humanities, you understand that we as individuals are influenced by different factors: our culture, our religion, our community, our parents, our friends, what we see on TV, and it is this complex nature of us as individuals and what makes us tick that gives us insights into how communities work. And if you can understand that, then we can work together to create, I suppose, a future that's not only better for us, but better for our children and future generations.
Wow. That's good to hear. And it's been excellent talking to you. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed chatting to you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.